Left of the box. I'm going to get into some stories about police shootings of Indigenous people, and specifically. So just a content warning going into that, definite tone change. Not that the things we've been talking about are happy-go-lucky, but this is pretty bad. It's really bad, the state of the situations, because I don't know if it was my last live stream or the live stream before that. I covered a story about a teenager, a boy, 15 years old, who was shot by two RCMP officers. Two of them shot him to death. And he had called for help because he was having a mental health episode, and they shot him. And I talked a bit about that. It got worse, if you can believe it or not. So in the past couple weeks, not even, 6 Indigenous people have been killed by law enforcement. There's no excuse for that, but let's get into it.
6 Indigenous people have been killed across Canada in police-involved incidents since August 29th. That was the day 31-year-old Jack Charles Peach from Clearwater, Dene Nation in Saskatchewan was hit by an RCMP vehicle while walking on the 909 Grid Road off Highway 155 near Buffalo Narrows. Just one day later, 15-year-old Hoss Lightning from Samson Cree Nation in Alberta was shot by RCMP during a confrontation after police confiscated several weapons from the teen. September 3rd in Winnipeg.
So this was the story that I talked about in my video. So they say they confiscated weapons, but they didn't say what those weapons were. He was in a mental health crisis. Pretty much when you're in a mental health crisis, anything could be considered a weapon. Like what, was he holding a pencil? The reality was, I seriously doubt he was holding anything that was an actual threat to the RCMP officers. I seriously doubt anything he was holding was a threat, but they just got labeled as weapons.
September 3rd in Winnipeg, 39-year-old Tammy Bateman was hit by a police cruiser driving through an encampment at Fort Rouge Park. Incidents have extended beyond the prairies. On September 6th, Jason West, a 57-year-old Indigenous man, was shot during a confrontation with Windsor police in Ontario. September 8th, 31-year-old Danny Knife from Atakakoop Cree Nation in Saskatchewan was shot by Shellbrook RCMP during the response to an assault at the Cree Nation, which also resulted in non-life-threatening injuries to an officer. The same day, Stephen Iggy Didam from Elsipogtog First Nation in New Brunswick was shot by RCMP. Officers say Didam was in mental distress, had a weapon, and would not cooperate with police. Dominic Didam, Stephen Didam's uncle, is saying his death and many others in the community did not need to happen.
He was a kind person, generous. He was fun. He was funny. He was kind. He took care of a lot of people. He would do without as long as his son, his girlfriend, or other people were happy.
This is how Dominique says he left Stephen the night he was killed. Dominique says within 20 minutes, 2 officers were at their door after Stephen's girlfriend called 911 saying he was going to hurt himself.
The 2 that were there that were originally there didn't do anything to try to help him. The only thing they did is they handcuffed them. A level-headed officer, RCMP officer, came in. You know, there's some good officer came in and at least put dressing on him and, you know, called the ambulance right away.
Dominique believes police officers did not need to use lethal force, saying his nephew could have been talked down with IndigiWatch, a group meant to work with police to de-escalate situations. Dominique confirms they were not on the scene. So with 6 separate incidents across the country, people are asking if these are truly one-off situations or if there is a larger issue with officers' response and behavior in instances where Indigenous people are present.
It's hard for us as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in this country to answer the question, who do we call when we need help? Because we certainly can't call police or RCMP.
Community leader in Winnipeg, Michael Redhead Champagne, says deaths of people like Peace, Lightning, Bateman, West, Knife, and D-Dam are examples of the broken kinship between Indigenous communities and law enforcement.
What we do see is when Indigenous-led and de-escalation-led safety practices are applied in situations where folks are heated or escalated. At least in the projects that I'm connected to, sometimes in 80 to 90% of those cases, those escalated individuals end up calming down. Why? Because they're humanized, they're respected, they're referred to an appropriate resource, and, oh yeah, they're not shot and killed when they're asking for support.
In all of the cases, independent watchdogs like the Serious Incident Response Team are investigating all the deaths. In Winnipeg, Joanne Roberts, City News.
We always hear about the police shootings in the United States because there's so often and so many. And it's not just shootings. There's other ways that people die while in police custody. And we always look to the United States because of how bad they are, and they are the worst by far. But out of comparable countries, Canada is second. Majority of people who die in the police presence are Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. And the majority of those cases are people suffering from mental health crises. But Brandy Morin, Indigenous reporter, just to give you some context, the context is horrifying. Indigenous peoples in Canada make up 5% of the total population. 6 Indigenous peoples were killed by RCMP and police within 11 days, August 29th to September 8th, 2024. That would be the equivalent to 114 non-Indigenous people in Canada being shot by RCMP and police within 11 days. 114 people. That's what the equivalent would be. When it comes to disproportionate representation in the police system, in shootings and stuff like that, again, you hear about the United States and how bad it is. So like in the United States, something like 30% of the men in prison are Black, but they only make up 15% of the population. And that's an indication of systemic racism and all that sort of stuff. But then what you don't hear is what it's like here in Canada. And this is from the Government of Canada website. Parliamentary Committee notes overrepresentation Indigenous offenders. The Correctional Service of Canada, CSC, continues to see an increase of the proportion of federally sentenced Indigenous offenders. Despite accounting for approximately 5% of the adult population, Indigenous peoples continue to be overrepresented in the federal correctional system, accounting for 28% of all federally sentenced individuals and 32% of all individuals in custody. And Indigenous women account for 50% of all federally incarcerated women. That is a policing choice there. That is systemic colonialism, settlerism. It is, again, the RCMP was literally created to police Indigenous peoples. That is systemic issues with the government underfunding their communities, of ripping apart their families, of like being targeted specifically by their lives not being held as being valuable by law enforcement. This is just absolutely disgusting. When I say that the genocide in Canada is ongoing, they're ongoing genocides, because this should not be happening. Not even close. This is a policy choice. This is a systemic colonial choice. This is targeting of Indigenous peoples. And it's not just this. It's not just people in prison. From Statistics Canada, Indigenous foster children living in private households, rates and societal demographic characteristics of foster children and their households. Indigenous children are vastly overrepresented among foster children in Canada. In 2021, Indigenous children accounted for 7% of children under the age of 15 in the general population, but 53.8% of children in foster care, like 7% of the population of children under 15 are Indigenous, but over 50% of children in foster care are Indigenous. Like, yes, the residential schools got shut down, but then came the day schools. Then came the foster care system. It's just another way to rip apart these families. Instead of providing the resources to the families to stay together the way that they want to stay together, they're just ripped apart. So just some highlights from this report. There was an increase in the overrepresentation of Indigenous children among foster children in private households from 2011 to 2021. 47.8 of all foster children in 2011 to 51.7 in 2016 and 53.7 in 2021. Disparity rates of Indigenous and non-Indigenous foster children increased from 2011 to 2021, with the largest increase seen among Inuit children. Among the provinces and territories, Manitoba had the highest rate of Indigenous foster children per 1,000 Indigenous children from 2011 to 2021, with a decrease in rates observed between 2016 and 2021. Disparity between rates of Indigenous and non-Indigenous foster children increased from 2011 to 2021 for most provinces and territories, with the highest disparity observed in Western provinces, specifically Alberta. Disparity rates was higher among Indigenous foster children living in large urban population centers compared to rural areas. Rates of foster children were higher among First Nation children living off reserve compared to on reserve, and among Inuit children living outside of Inuit, not sure how to say that, compared to inside the area. Foster children rate among First Nations and non-Indigenous children was highest for those aged 10 to 14. Among Métis, it was highest for children from 0 to 4 and 5 to 9, while among Inuit children, it was highest for those 5 to 9. Just over half of First Nations, 50.6%, and Inuit children, 51.6%, and 3/5, 63.4% of Métis children in foster care lived with non-Indigenous foster parents. In 2021, this proportion was higher in large urban population centers. This is Canada. And the thing is that the people responsible for a lot of the horrors inflicted on Indigenous peoples are never held accountable. Now, this is going to seem a little odd, but I'll skip to this article and then I'll connect it back to this. So recently it's been popping up that releasing names of 900 alleged Nazi war criminals who fled to Canada could embarrass federal government, bureaucrats told. This is a recent article, came out September 4th of this year, and there's been some hoopla on it on social media with people saying, oh, the Liberals should release the names. They're just worried about, what this will do for publicity and so on and so forth. Large numbers of soldiers from Ukrainian Waffen SS division fled to Canada after the Second World War. One of them was even given a standing ovation in the House of Commons. A list of 900 alleged Nazi war criminals who fled to Canada could remain secret as federal officials came under increased pressure to censor the records because they could prove embarrassing to this country. Oh no, they might get their Fifi hurt. Might be a little embarrassed to let other places know how many Nazis we took in. It'd be interesting to know how many Nazis we took in compared to how many Jewish people we took in during the war. Library and Archive Canada in Ottawa consulted in June and July with what is called a discrete group of individuals or organizations about whether the list should be made public according to documents obtained by Ottawa citizen. Keep in mind, a lot of these people who fled to Canada are probably dead, old age, that sort of thing. So releasing their names, it might embarrass their families. It might embarrass the government to let them know, because then you would find out like what positions they got into, what professions, maybe what roles in the government they got, all that sort of stuff. But the vast majority of them are probably dead and will never be held accountable for being Nazis. They'll never be held accountable. Those consulted include members of Canada's Ukrainian community, records show, But Library and Archives Canada, also known as LAC, did not include Holocaust survivors nor Holocaust scholars who had advocated for full release of the list. Alleged Nazis were criminals, Jewish and Holocaust academics say. Some of the individuals and organizations consulted by LAC argue against releasing any of the information, warning it could be embarrassing or lead to prosecution of alleged war criminals. Oh no! The horror that war criminals could be prosecuted. No! Can't have that. Can't have war criminals be prosecuted. At least not the war criminals we allow into this country. A few stakeholders were concerned that the release of the report would result in new legal action, criminal prosecution, citizen revocation, or otherwise, being brought against the individuals named in the report, a summary of the library's discussion noted. How about, let's prosecute them. Let's do that. Other stakeholders who advised LAC worried that the list would embarrass Canada's Ukrainian community or be used by Russia for propaganda purposes, the record shows. I don't think much could be, look at what else Russia is using. Russia will use whatever. That's no excuse not to bring Nazis to court. That's no excuse. Large numbers of soldiers from Ukrainian Waffen SS division fled to Canada after the war. Library and Archives Canada had hoped to release information to the public between September 16th and September 20th, but how many names of the alleged Nazi war criminals will actually be made public is not yet known. The list is part of a 1986 War Crimes Commission led by Justice Jules something. The names were compiled from RCMP files and other documents. And I don't need to go through the rest of this just to understand the hypocrisy of this country, just the way that they want to hide these criminals. They don't want to release the names of these Nazis. But if you knew what I knew already, this is not shocking in the least. I am not surprised that they won't name these people. Not surprised at all. Why? Because I've already covered this article in some of my news videos. Indian residential schools. 5,300 alleged abusers located by Ottawa. These are people. So the last residential schools were shut down in the 90s. A lot of these people are still alive, still benefiting from this country. People who were running these residential schools where Indigenous children were brutalized in every way possible. Many were killed. 17 private investigation firms contacted by the government at a cost of over $1.5 million to help settle abuse claims. So the only reason why we know this isn't because somebody was out for, to hold them accountable. No, that wasn't what it was for. Investigators hired by the federal government had located thousands of people accused of physically and sexually abusing students at Canada's Indian residential schools, though they may never face criminal charges. As part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, the government located 5,315 alleged abusers, both former employees and students. 17 private investigation firms were contracted at a cost of over $1.5 million beginning in 2005, according to information provided by Indigenous and North Affairs Canada. The alleged perpetrators, however, weren't tracked down to face criminal charges. No, they weren't tracked down to face criminal charges. It was to see if they would be willing to participate in hearings to determine compensation for residential school survivors. The independent assessment process, IAP, not involving the courts, was set up to resolve the most severe abuse claims. So this was to see if they would participate in this other thing, to see if survivors of these schools should be compensated. It's not to bring them to justice for the horrors that they unleashed. It's not to hold them accountable. So am I surprised that these 900 Nazi war criminals won't have their names released? That they won't be held accountable if they're still alive? No. because there's over 5,300 people that should be in front of a judge right now. Right now. So then does it surprise me that over half of foster children are Indigenous? That half of women in custody are Indigenous? That over 30% waiting, like just sentenced, are Indigenous? No, that's this country. That is what this country was built on. Built on genocide and exploitation. It makes me so mad what this country is, what it pretended to be when I was a kid growing up versus what it actually is. It's just disgusting. It's nothing like what they claimed it was. You know, all the pride that they pump into you as a children, you know, making it seem like Canada was this glorious nation and so progressive and tolerant and stuff. And it's like, no, won't even hold the worst people accountable for their crimes. Just disgusting. And that's a choice. That's a policy choice through all of the governments, through all of Canada's history. That's been a choice. And that's part of, again, like, I have no faith in Justin Trudeau doing the right thing when his dad was prime minister, when over 60 residential schools were still in operation. Justin Trudeau doesn't exactly want to see accountability because of what that would do to his family name.